Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are here for another one of your questions about work. And oh, look at that. I forgot our usual, let's make sure we look at what the question is today. For those of you who are here for the first time, I'm Roy. I'm a startup investor in the future of work, and we tackle your questions about work. So, Lori, today we got a question from an unnamed friend of mine.
An unnamed source brought up a question that we all thought was interesting. So to reintroduce myself, I'm Lori, and I'm an investor that works at Bloomberg Beta on Roy's team. And as soon as this question came up today, we were like, we have to go live and talk about it. So the question of how do you handle a boss who frequently changes their mind? Roy, I'm curious what you think, both from the boss side and from your experience throughout your whole career.
Yeah. And I will fully acknowledge I am a person who changes my mind. Actually, Jeff Bezos, so I'm not like a huge Jeff Bezos acolyte anymore the way I once was. I used to carry his 1997 shareholder letter in my briefcase. And I mean, he's still brilliant in a bunch of ways. And he says this thing about, smart people change their mind a lot because the data comes in. So I think that there's a first phase, which is probably a phase that most people get past pretty quickly, which is just the diagnosis phase of like, why does this person change their mind? We're all human. We change our mind. Is it because they forget and you're re-asking them the same question, expecting them to be some kind of a robot who remembers what their past views were, and they just don't do that? Is it that they are indifferent to the cost that it might have or unaware of the cost it might have? Is it that, they actually like the power that comes with being mercurial? And there are lots of valid and not valid reasons to change your mind. Whether it is valid or not is, of course, in the eye of the beholder. But I think it starts with a why, a guess about why. And then what follows from that is sort of the settings of like, are they changing their mind on like, okay, you told us our priority for this quarter should be X, and then a week into the quarter, you told us to drop that as a priority and nothing changed in the world. That's super different from, from like you said blue and now you're saying red. And so I'll speak for myself for a second first, which is I think people perceive me to change my mind slightly more often than I change my mind, although I do change my mind. And part of that, I think, is because I will say things that seem different, but in fact, there's some nuance to like, oh no, that was in this situation. But you said you wanted people to always prepare in this way. And it's like, no, now you want them to prepare in this way. And so sometimes curiosity goes a long way. And even just reflecting back to me, hey, it seems like you used to say X. Now you're saying Y. What happened? So that's one thing you can do.
Well, and we've definitely had, sorry, just to jump in with an example of that, which like we have all the time around how do we write to each other about when we're looking at startups and what level of detail do we go into, how many extra, layers of research or thinking of questions to ask them. And one of the realizations that I had that I think is just true across all situations with a boss that changes their mind is putting yourself in an ownership mentality of what would I do and what would I think if I owned this? So for example, like with the question about how much information do I send them, instead of thinking how much information does this person want, think what would I want if I were them? And then I think flipping that makes a huge difference.
I think that's really good. And then be aware they may want something different, in which case it's on them to communicate that. And once you know, you know. And so that's one thing you can do. I think a second thing you can do is you can make them aware of the cost of changing their mind. Like, hey, last Tuesday, you told such and such that you wanted this to be this way. If you now stop that, they may feel their work was wasted, and that may be demoralizing for them, which, by the way, the cost might be acceptable, but somebody needs to, it's possible they're changing their mind because they're just not aware of what the cost was. So it's like reminding them of what they said in the past, making clear the cost, and then to the extent that there are patterns to it, and then I'll just stop in a second. I have a few other thoughts, but I'll stop in a second. But to the extent there are patterns to when they change their mind, then what you can do is make them aware of the patterns. Like, hey, I've noticed, and this is classic, like we have other episodes on how to give good feedback. I've noticed that you frequently in this situation change your mind. The impact it has on me is this, and ... And you're trying to get them to aggregate it. And then ultimately, well, we'll talk more about, things you do if that doesn't work. But how does all that land? What do you think?
So thinking of all these examples. So for the second point about the cost, the people that do that really well are, well, ideally, product managers and engineers, because if the product manager changes their mind about what the priority is, then the engineering manager usually very calmly says, okay, great. That means this other thing that you want is now postponed by a month. And you just have to sit there and then think, okay, like, what am I going to do with this information? And it's not, shouldn't be a tension in terms of personality and like somebody's time wasted. It just is talking about the impact. And I think we could use a lot of that.
What I hear in that is, first of all, that it's not coming from a place of complaining. It's coming from a place of just acknowledging like the world changes sometimes, and that you need to have trust. I've seen people who make a consequence where the consequence just doesn't sound credible because they don't want to change. It's like, oh, if you change that, well, then we're going to have to deliver that totally trivial thing in Q4. And it's like, nah. And so it's important to have a high level of trust and credibility on things. But sorry, keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you didn't. That's such a good point. And I think that goes back to the idea of intellectual honesty and both being honest as, you know, the person that did the work. Maybe there was something that I didn't do in my initial research of understanding what needed to be done. And then also your point, that third point that you made, as the boss realizing, oh, I might have this habit. And maybe this is something that is effective and on purpose. And maybe there's sometimes that it needs to change.
Yeah, and I think I've been sometimes alarmed when I receive the feedback. Because I'm like, I never realized that. Now, does that result in changed behavior? Like I might intend for my behavior to change, but the behavior, the patterns might be really ingrained, in which case it's difficult. And so then to me, the next question is, what if I can't have that conversation directly with this person? What if it is somebody who is several layers removed from me in the organization? What do I do then? And I think then it's a matter of finding the allies and indirect ways of reaching the person. Like, okay, you know, if you're a skip report to them, is your boss willing to go to them? Maybe your boss doesn't even know the cost of their boss's changes on you. And so you have to kind of do it indirectly. And to some degree, if you have trust with coworkers, you might be developing a shared plan with them about what may happen. And then, as with many attempts to change something in the workplace, one way I think of it is, how do you escalate through various less risky to riskier ways to change? Least risky is like, they'll do anything. Well, that doesn't change anything.
Let it go.
Make your trusted coworker, your trusted boss aware of something slightly. Most risky is like 10 of us walk in at once and they're like, excuse me, but you are causing catastrophe in this organization and we are staging an intervention, which you may choose to do that. Consequence, maybe it may be a career limiting move for you internally in the company or not, and sometimes, by the way, people try to get somebody fired over this, which, it's not like wrong to try to get somebody fired if they're doing a bad job and you've tried to approach it with them in an above board way. Sometimes that's just what you need to do. But I think what it ultimately gets to is, what can you tolerate? Because if it's so miserable you can't tolerate it, then sometimes it ends up being a matter of like, do I want to stay in this job or do I not?
Yes. And I think that's a really important point, because the cost side, when I think about going to a higher up, especially a skip level or even beyond that, is there's no point bringing anything up to them that's not through the lens of how does it impact the business or how does it impact their goals. If it's only impacting me, then it's kind of not a conversation worth having. And then that's where you get to the question of like, sure, I can spin my wheels and do things that never get shipped, like classic Amazon. Or maybe I want somewhere where I have more autonomy, and that's fine. Right. Yeah.
And my only tweak on that is I do think it's okay, and I think this is implied in what you're saying. I think it's okay to tell somebody about the impact on you, so long as it's in the context of like, look, something that impacts me also impacts the organization. Like, you don't need to make that explicit, but it's like, I can't get as much work done or something like that. And, and I also just want to acknowledge that how you communicate that, and easy for me to say as a white guy, is probably varies a lot depending on how you are perceived by your coworkers. And my guess is it's very different for women than for men. My guess is it may vary depending on like race and socioeconomic class and other factors. And so just I'm conscious of the fact that, again, this is not advice because I'm not telling anybody else what to do, but that what counts as escalating through a series of steps, or what may be heard as being about you versus about the business may vary depending on who is delivering the message, unfortunately.
That is so true. And I think that there's an opportunity there for bosses and leaders to think about what they might not be hearing because of, just inherent bias.
Yeah. And, I think there's also a factor. I've fortunately never had a boss who I thought was flipped their mind a lot about things. But when I've seen other people behave that way, it's often clustered with other quote unquote bad behaviors, micromanagement or, inappropriate micromanagement, by the way, because some micromanagement is totally fine.
Necessary, yeah.
Yeah, and actually even good. Like, you want the CEO of the company getting really particular about some detail that really matters about the design of the company's most important product. It's just a question of selection. So I often say it's a question of timing and dosage, but I also think in this case, it's a question of selection of, do you fundamentally have faith that the things this person is micromanaging actually really matter to the outcome? And if you do, then, you got to accept it, even if sometimes it's really painful. But, if this is cluster, if this mind-changing stuff is clustered with other bad behavior, then you have to understand you're not just approaching a single issue in isolation. You may be giving feedback about related issues, and then it is timing and dosage, because somebody once said this to me about golf, that you can only help somebody improve their golf swing in one way at the same time.
Yeah.
Only golf clubs I've ever swung, I think, are mini golf clubs. So I know golf, and maybe I once went to a driving range, but I definitely get the idea. As a person who often gives people comprehensive feedback, I don't think it's that valuable. I think giving somebody one thing to focus on at a time and just figuring, is this the most important thing for that person, is pretty important.
Yes. And that's so hard. Not to, downplay that that's a challenging thing to do, especially for folks earlier in their career.
Because you want it all to change right fucking now.
Yeah.
And that's, again, that's understandable. I remember I had a boss who, he was the kind of person who would send super long emails, paragraphs, paragraphs, and paragraphs. And this is before you could have ChatGPT, summarize the email. And I often perceived him to have arbitrarily different views on different things, but it was just because he had a lot of views. And I was like, listen, what I ultimately had to say to him is we just can't keep up with you. And so if you want us to be able to support you, we're going to need you to simplify what you're asking us to do and make it a little narrower. And then you end up kind of in a negotiation, which often in success, these problem-solving exercises about somebody frequently changing their mind turns into a negotiation. Okay, I'll try to avoid changing my mind about whether we need a short presentation or a long one, but I'm going to need you to understand that sometimes it's important to me for this reason or whatever it is, or I can make 3 capricious changes of my mind per month or whatever. I mean, it's like any other personal relationship. You negotiate what works.
Well, with your example, did you end up having a negotiation?
It ended up being no. It ended up being that he nodded and said he agreed and then kept doing it. But then the project ended and he was no longer my boss because it was project-based work. And then I moved on to the next person. And while I'm still friendly with that guy, and I think he's a good guy, and I hope he's not watching right now and wondering whether this is him, I would never want to work with him again because it was just annoying. It wasn't worth it, the value I was getting as the employee.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And I think another topic I wanted to bring up was around the tendency that folks more junior in their career have to spend a lot of time working on something without checking in and taking something really far in a direction where if they had paused and just had one tiny check-in, they could have gotten redirected earlier because more information would have come to light.
Totally. It's really interesting because this same boss pointed out to me, he's like, you see how this other person on the team who was a few years junior to me, but was really good at this, will check in with me on his approach before he starts working. That's really effective. And I was like, oh, so what seems to me to be micromanagement is just because I overshot the goal, thinking I was going to impress the guy by pulling a rabbit out of a hat, when really coordination matters more than surprise.
Yes. And I think that really is the heart of, you are not a performer for your boss. You are on the same team trying to solve the same problem. Totally. If you're making a deck, you both want to communicate the same,
And message. Look, surprise can be great and outperforming expectations can be great, but you got to be really careful about what you pick, because if you pick the wrong stuff or and it doesn't take much. It's like, oh, I noticed you were working on this thing. I mean, look, yesterday, the day before, when I was working on this talk that I delivered yesterday, it was like you said twice in the 3 days leading up to it, something like, hey, I noticed you're working on this thing. Do you need anything? It's like, I can't think of anything. And then that morning I was like, I could really use some help manipulating these images. And even though it felt like a pretty minor request, and to be honest, if I had been left to my own devices, I probably wouldn't have asked. But because you offered a couple of times and I felt like, okay, it's a little annoying, but like I can give you enough warning and maybe it won't be too bad, I felt comfortable asking. And as a result, we coordinated well together as a team. And so I guess one way of relating that to the topic at hand is there are bad bosses for sure who change their minds a lot, but at least some of their mind changing might be addressable by more frequently checking in with somebody before you go running off and doing something. And the more they change their mind, I think the more there's license to check in. And if they don't want you checking in that much, then they shouldn't fucking change their mind that much.
Yeah. I painfully was told once, painfully because it was very true, that from every bad boss, you can at least learn something. And so even the person that changes their mind the absolute most, where it's like ineffective, could teach you something about a boss later down the line who changes their mind in a way that's reasonable.
Yeah, totally what the distinction is. All right. Yeah. Any other thoughts before we wrap?
I had one more that I really want to mention is around I've experienced this personally, of that feeling of, oh my gosh, this work that I did wasn't used. And it, sometimes you can't help but feel emotional or frustrated. Yeah. Or just like elevated. And something that I remind myself of all the time is that no situation has ever been improved by being frantic. And so when I see that in myself, I don't say like, oh, forget about it, it's not a big deal. It's like, how do I like get myself down to a place where I can talk about this effectively? Because otherwise, if everybody's like, well, and like you're up here, you're not going to get to a good outcome.
I think that is such a good piece of advice. It's sort of wait before, if you feel something physically in you that is causing you harm, wait before you respond. Is definitely, I think a really good rule of thumb. All right. Well, thank you. And just, if you're watching us for the first time, the reason we say this is not advice is because we don't know what you should be doing. We only know our own experiences. And thank you, Maura, for setting us up today and basically every time we do this. And to be continued, if you have other questions for us, let us know. Bye, Lori.
Bye.